No kid's Jewish education should end at 13. Adjerba offers Ontario high school credits infused with Jewish learning online for teens across the province. Ministry approved, intellectually demanding, Jewishly transformative. Adjerba.ca. That's ADRABA.ca. Your teen belongs here.
What's the story behind the push to have Ontario school boards adopt policies to combat anti-Palestinian racism? And why has it prompted an outcry of concern from many families of Jewish students, from Jewish school staff, and from some Jewish human rights groups? The Ontario government recently put more than half a dozen school boards, including in Toronto and Ottawa, under the supervision of the Ministry of Education. So this has effectively halted official school board discussions on the issue there for now. But the debate over anti-Palestinian racism policies, or APR for short, isn't over. It's just moved out of the spotlight. And for weeks, our Mitchell Consky, the Canadian Jewish News' education and campus reporter, has been digging into why the campaign for school boards to adopt APR policies has become such a flashpoint. What's at stake for Jewish and Israeli families, and also for Palestinian ones and their allies? His story was published in the CJN last week, and his investigation also uncovered evidence that the Canadian government has been funding APR advocates, even though they strongly oppose Canada's widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism, known as the IRA definition, which is official government policy, although the APR groups say this framework actually causes anti-Palestinian racism. So we're bringing Mitch on to tell us more about his reporting, what APR is, how the clash is playing out on the ground and in the schools.
A lot of these policies aren't just about protecting Palestinian identity. It's about delegitimizing Israeli identity. It's about debunking any criticism towards APR policy, and so much so that even any disagreements with those politics could count as APR under the framework that they've established.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Friday, February 20th, 2026. Welcome to North Star, the flagship podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Mitchell Consky's cover story in the CJN is entitled, "What is anti-Palestinian racism, and what does it mean for Ontario schools?" It was published February 11th. You can read it later. I've put the link for you in our show notes. It took Consky weeks to piece the story together. He joins me now to explain how he did it, who he interviewed, what he learned, and what you should know. Welcome. It's good to see you, Mitch.
Thanks for having me, Ellen. Great talking to you.
Well, thank you for coming on and sharing the weeks of work that you put into this story. Our listeners may or may not know what anti-Palestinian racism is if they don't have kids in public schools or elsewhere in maybe other civil society sectors. Why did you want to do a deep dive into this concept?
So in February of last year, I sat through 2 exhaustive TDSB meetings, the Toronto District School Board. Each meeting ran around 11 hours, and it was after the TDSB received a report on anti-Semitism. It was one of the most extensive community consultation reports in TDSB history. And right after that report was received, there were votes about how to integrate some of the recommendations into the TDSB's larger anti-hate framework. Right after that happened, there was a barrage of anti-Israel voices that spoke during the delegation hearing of these meetings. And the term APR was widely used then. APR stands for anti-Palestinian racism, and it's a term that is at odds with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and it's kind of baked into this larger ideological controversy that is really the through line throughout all my reporting.
Back to those February meetings, the Toronto District School Board, just to bring us up to speed, they were trying to do a separate anti-Semitism policy on how to handle the rising cases of reported anti-Semitism in the schools. And then
Right.
while you were listening to this, hundreds of people signed up to speak for 5 minutes. I remember you didn't go to bed till like 2 a.m. one night covering this stuff on Zoom, right?
Yeah. 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 I mean, if it's a term that's used so often, I figured that we should get to the root of the debate. We should try to figure out what it actually means, but also we should try to understand how it would function in a school system. After that meeting, some TDSB trustees did vote to integrate APR into a larger anti-hate framework. This ended up not happening because of the provincial takeover. As we know, last year, the Minister of Education stepped in and they are now provincially in charge of multiple Ontario school boards, but it kind of halted a lot of identity specific hate policies, including work on anti-Semitism that trustees have been working on for years that was going to be the result of these community consultations. One of the biggest concerns that came up is that if APR is now entering the discussion, what definition are we going to use? How are we going to define it? And so that ultimately led me into not just talking to the critics of APR, but also the proponents of APR policy and trying to actually unpack what it means and how it would function in practice.
When did it get coined in Canada and by whom? And then tell me a little bit more about what it is. If you want to even read the definition, it's fine too.
So it was coined in 2022 by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, ACLA. And I'm going to read a small excerpt of what their definition is. It's available online and it's also in my story. So anti-Palestinian racism is a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases, stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives. Anti-Palestinian racism takes various forms, including denying the Nakba and justifying violence against Palestinians, failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people with a collective identity, as well as erasing the human rights and equal dignity and worth of Palestinians. It also includes Palestinian allies, so supporters of the Palestinian narrative. If their narrative is rejected, that could actually constitute as APR. Now, in the definition, as well as other resources and materials created by ACLA, they are very clear with their position against Israel. They believe that IHRA is a smokescreen for deflecting any criticism against Israel. I spoke to a Palestinian parent, and her concern is that it is a matter of her kid's Palestinian identity being immediately painted as anti-Semitic or extremist or radical. And so there's a clear concern amongst Palestinian families here in terms of their kids' identities being immediately demonized or delegitimized. And that's clear. But what the problem that I've identified in this reporting is that a lot of these definitions, a lot of these policies aren't just about protecting Palestinian identity. It's about delegitimizing Israeli identity. It's about debunking any criticism towards APR policy, and so much so that even any disagreements with those politics could count as APR under the framework that they've established.
Well, what did the Jewish lobby groups and parents say is the problem, or many of the problems, besides the earlier ones that you've just said?
Well, it's using a lot of the same language that's been conveyed in a lot of anti-Israel initiatives, a lot of anti-Israel campaigns. It's painting all of Israel as a white colonial state, ethnic cleansing, apartheid. Like, these are terms that are in the definition, and they're terms that are flaunted around by both ACLA and Toronto Palestinian families. So I want to speak about, and I'm sure you're going to ask about this, but the specific problem here.
Yeah.
And the problem isn't that boards are adopting APR policy, because that's not happening right now. I spoke to York Region and TDSB specifically for the story. There's other ones that are relevant, but both of those school boards, as well as other school boards, have told me that they are not focusing on identity-specific policy, and that they will keep their anti-hate framework more broad. The problem is that there's sort of this underground push in the peripheral that is rising and that is pushing this APR perspective.
Well, you said underground. What does that mean?
It's coming from parent councils. It's coming from anti-Israel teachers. It's coming from materials that are being submitted and passed around amongst parent councils. An example would be this pamphlet that was distributed last year. It was called Navigating the TDSB. This was written by Toronto Palestinian families. They are an organization that actually received some funding from Canadian Heritage last year, which we can also get into. Speaking briefly about that, was a guide for Palestinian and ally families. It was about 38 pages, and the document, among many other claims, illustrates how APR is framed in practice and characterizes Palestinian oppression as the product of settler colonialism carried out by Israel in accordance with the political ideology of Zionism. So, the problem here is that it actually casts all of Zionism as an agent of erasure. It claims that Zionism is a force that will erase the identity of Palestinians, and disagreeing with that claim could actually constitute as APR. Boards don't control parent councils. They can't control what parents are saying. If parents are gathering and these parent councils are elected and they stand on behalf of their students, then it can push policy in an unofficial way. So this is really the heart of the dispute right now. And where it leaves school boards and administrators is they're ultimately just stepping away from it entirely. York Region, they're not touching this, and TDSB, they're not touching this either. And that's not to say that the push isn't going to keep trying to make some change, but right now nothing is happening.
There are other school boards where these policies are not on the books, as you said, officially, but being considered. Some of them have it on their website, anti-Palestinian racism, as well as the other isms, including anti-Semitism. I want to ask you, you talked about parents, and you spoke to a Palestinian parent. Did you have challenges finding actual parents to talk to you on the record from either side?
Yeah, that's the concern. Like, it is difficult to speak to parents generally for this beat because everything's dialed up to 11 and parents want to protect their children. So it's hard. I did manage to speak to one Palestinian parent. I spoke to an anonymous Jewish parent and another parent that was willing to give me their name. And what I found interesting is that there's some symmetry to their fear. What I mean by that is that they're both afraid that the opposing side is going to erase their kid's identity, and a Palestinian might believe that the IHRA definition, it debunks any criticism of Israel, which is not the case. And we know that the IHRA definition allows criticism against Israel as long as it's the same degree that any other country would, or that it's not a disproportionate amount of criticism.
Double standard, correct.
But, there seems to be this symmetrical fear of erasure. That's the theme that I'm seeing with both parents. But what's interesting, and what a Jewish parent pointed out, his family is Israeli. His wife is Israeli. His kids are therefore also part Israeli. And he pointed out that it becomes just disagreeing with them. It's a dangerous thing. And I'm actually gonna share the quote that Aaron told me. The core issue is that opposing or even questioning an anti-Israel narrative can be treated as a form of harm according to APR frameworks. Disagreeing with someone's political perspective becomes offensive speech. So when disagreement is framed as racism, he said, it takes a part of your identity and says it's wrong. He worries that expressing attachment to Israel or defending its existence can be interpreted as discriminatory rather than as identity-based speech. That flips what anti-hate protections are supposed to do. Instead of protecting people from being dehumanized, it ends up delegitimizing them. And I think that really is the crux of the argument. That is the conflict that we're trying to unpack. Jeffa, who he was previously a part of, they also...
Parents for Education.
Jewish Educators and Families Association. They sent a public letter to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, simply cautioning against the implications of APR. They cited specific examples. One child at Halton District School, for instance, was accused of APR because she expressed concerns over a map of Israel being labeled as Palestine. And there are other examples such as this. And their arguments is that APR is a very political term, but it's also trying to deflect politics. They're trying to make it seem that it's not political and that it's based on identity, but there's so many implications that are tied to the geopolitical conflict that it's almost impossible to separate the two.
I'm surprised at how complicated it sounds and how fraught this issue is when it's not government policy, APR. It's not like IRA definition is. It was adopted in 2019 by the Canadian Trudeau government. It was adopted in many provinces. Almost all of the provinces in subsequent years have adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. But APR is not government policy yet at all, right? Anywhere.
No.
So what is Ottawa's role in having both of these competing definitions, fighting it out in schools? And is there some kind of disconnect?
Well, there is, specifically when it comes to grants and funding. So as we know, Ottawa has adapted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism since 2019. And I have also clarified with Canadian Heritage, which is a branch of the Canadian government, in terms of their funding policies. Canadian Heritage clarified with me that they would not fund an organization that explicitly rejects IHRA. Canadian Heritage spokesperson Daniel Savoy said all organizations receiving federal funding must take steps to ensure they respect the values underlying the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Human Rights Acts, and Canada's anti-racism strategy, including the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. That's an exact quote that I got from Canadian Heritage. Now, the contradiction that I uncovered in my reporting is that their funding doesn't actually echo those sentiments. Public records show that Canadian Heritage awarded $99,500 to Toronto Palestinian families for a project titled Combating Anti-Semitism and Anti-Palestinian Racism for all of 2024. This was running from January to March of 2025. And a separate grant of $99,950 was awarded to the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, ACLA, for understanding anti-Palestinian racism, educational resources, and training for inclusive practices. Why is that such a big deal? Well, because both ACLA and Toronto Palestinian families told me that they explicitly reject the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So in other words, Ottawa is saying one thing and then funding the complete opposite of what they're saying. And I did press for more clarity as to why that's the case, and I didn't get much more. Now, Toronto Palestinian families, they're the ones that actually crafted that guide that I mentioned, Navigating the TDSB, which paints all Zionism as agents of erasure against Palestinian identities and generally paints all of Israel as the aggressor and oppressor.
So demonizes Israel and Zionism, basically. Yeah.
I know. And I know that this is the common thread. This is the same story manifesting in different ways. But the real point here is that there's been contradiction with what Ottawa is aligning with, IHRA definition, and what they're funding. And that contradiction is something that should be considered.
So that surprised you when you were researching. Anything else that surprised you in reporting this story?
There was a parent that made a really good point. First of all, there already is anti-Arab and anti-Islam policy.
Islamophobia, yeah.
That school boards have adopted. I spoke to a teacher in York Region, Neil Orlovsky, and he questioned why we need a third label for a contentious area, for a geopolitical war, right? Why do we need to, if we already have a definition for anti-Islamophobia, if we already have a clear understanding of anti-Arab hate, why APR? Another parent extended that a little bit further and asked, well, if that's the case, we have, an APR framework, then what's stopping us from having an anti-Russian framework or anti-Ukrainian or anti-Israeli, right? It does open up this Pandora box of politics that's, for whatever reason, we're not willing to go through with other countries, but Israel or, the country that Israel is, quote, oppressing. That's something that people are obsessing over. And it's something that is causing school boards to try to react to. It's causing TDSB meetings to last way too long. And it's causing parent councils to get all up in arms and figure out ways of integrating policy that is not clearly defined in any way that aligns with the Human Rights Charter.
Mentioned it doesn't align with the Human Rights Charter. Can you be more specific? That's important.
Well, it defines Zionism as inherently oppressive or colonial. It treats opposition to Palestinian narratives as inherently racist. It frames disagreement with slogans like "from the river to the sea" as discriminatory. It characterizes attachment to Israel as participation in settler colonialism. There's specific points in the charter that talks about political speech, national identity expression, advocacy for a state, and there's ways that the language can actually contradict the freedoms. And as long as a country is being unfairly characterized or disproportionately criticized, which is where the IHRA definition comes in handy here, that's when this slides into, it slides beyond political criticism, and it starts demonizing an entire group of people and generalizing them in a way that's it's not politically productive. It's not fair criticism.
And it could cross the line into violations of human rights law. I want to ask you what you think are the next steps, or what can we expect?
Things have cooled a little bit right now. Trustee Shelley Laskin cautioned against integrating APR policy. She is a trustee of the TDSB. She cautioned against integrating APR policy that doesn't have clear definitions. So as we look ahead, the hope is if APR will be in the discussion with anti-Semitism, with any other form of hate, that there will be clear definitions, that it won't erode any of the anti-Semitism work that's in check, and that we can address hate where it springs up. I'll end on a
And
quote.
this is what the leaders are telling you, and the parents are telling you, and the advocacy groups are telling you, right? Mm-hmm.
Neil Orlovsky, who's a teacher at Westmount Collegiate Institute in York Region, he had a great quote, and I ended the story on that. And he said, at some point, we have to ask where this ends. If we keep creating new categories tied to contested political conflicts, then what's the point of having definitions at all? When hate shows up, you address it. But once you start asking teachers to adjudicate history, borders, and legitimacy, you're asking them to do something schools were never designed to do. And that's where this all comes down to.
All right, we're going to just do a little preview of a story that you're working on now, which does have this APR theme in it as well. It's about the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, which is the union representing 84,000 teachers in Ontario. It's a very large union, and how APR may be playing a role in an anti-Semitism training issue. Can you just give us a little spoiler alert about what you're working on?
Okay. So I'm working on a story about ETFO, Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, hiring independent Jewish voices for anti-Semitism training for the provincial executive. This is a contentious story that has drawn criticism from multiple pro-Israel Jewish organizations throughout Canada, and it's leading to a lot of questions. What is this training going to entail? Is it going to talk about APR? Why did ETFO decide to deploy a third-party organization when there already are anti-Semitism workshops that have been established and resource material that's been written within their organization? There's a lot of questions that I'm hoping to answer, and I'm excited to get the story out in the next week.
Did you find out whether APR is going to be part of, or was supposed to be part of this training?
According to IJV, APR will be parts of their curriculum on anti-Semitism. To also explain a little bit more about IJV, they are an anti-Israel organization that rejects the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. When I spoke to their spokesperson, Issa Satel, she mentioned that part of their training is going to come to identifying anti-Semitism. That's going to be pretty contentious considering the fact that they reject what the vast majority of Jewish Canadians believe to be anti-Semitism. So I'm going to try to get as close to the story as possible, understand what IJV's approach is going to be, understand why ETFO hired them in the first place, and try to get to the bottom of what this all means.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. When that's out, our listeners and viewers will go to our cjn.ca website, the cjn.ca website, and read what you've got. Mitch, it's been great to go over this. I understand the story a lot better now, thanks to your story reporting and also our conversation. Thanks for being with us on the CJN's North Star podcast.
Thank you so much. Take care.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin's charitable foundation. If you learned something about the issue, here's one more thing you can do. Help more people discover this podcast by putting a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen. The link is also in our show notes on how to do that. North Star is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman, with Michael Freeman as our executive producer and Alicia Richler as the editorial director. Brett Higgins composed our theme. Thanks for listening, and if you want to write to us, we're at info@thecjn.ca.